I think to properly understand what is happening now, one is to go back to the history of ZANU-PF and try and understand the software of the political party called ZANU-PF, which essentially is a liberation movement. So you will notice that in the history of ZANU-PF, the role of the military has been quite central. You would see that between 1972 and 1975, the period that is referred to as the Badzenare Rebellion, the contestation between the civilian arm of ZANU-PF and the military arm was resolved essentially by the re-intervention of the military, who then took control of the party. You will see the same thing around 1975 with the Vashandi Rebellion, where the contestations, specifically in the military again, took center stage in the running of the political party, or of the liberation movement. So essentially we must understand ZANU-PF as a political movement which has its roots in liberation politics and therefore has a very militaristic way of approaching politics. So what we have seen in the recent past with the rise of General Chiwenga should not be new, because it is essentially the continuation of the narration of the re-establishment of the military as an important arm in the political conversations that happen in ZANU. So if you look at the cabinet, that cabinet is essentially a military cabinet. There are at least 4 or 5 people who are generals. You would also then see the re-entry of Chiwenga, which serves as a consolidation of that project. And Kembo Mohadi himself has a military background. He trained in Russia during the liberation struggle. So this represents the consolidation and the restoration of what they are calling the restore legacy, the re-establishment of the military as the controlling arm of ZANU-PF.
And I'm actually glad that you mentioned the other deputy, Kembo Mohadi. Now, what exactly do we know about him? I mean, beyond what you said about him training in Russia and him being a staunch member of the military, but what else does he bring to this position and the cabinet in general? Yes,
so what happened with immediately after independence, there were fissures between the two dominant political parties, ZANU and ZAPU. And there was the period of Kukurahundi, where essentially there is a perception that the ZANU-PF government led by Emmerson Mnangagwa and Robert Mugabe went on a rampage and decimated people in the southern part of the country in Matabeleland in the Kukurahundi period. That period was almost, I would say, pacified by bringing in the two political parties, ZAPU and ZANU, to form ZANU-PF. So what was then agreed was that 2 of the vice presidents, that explains why ZANU-PF has 2 vice presidents. One would come generally from the Shona side, and the other part would come from the Matabeleland side. So there's an attempt to say, let's balance regional politics by having one person coming from the ZANU side of ZANU. Remember, I'm saying there were 2 political parties, ZANU and ZAPU. Yes. So when they merged, the 2 vice presidents had to reflect the 2 different political parties. So the one vice president would come from ZANU, which is Constantine Chiwenga, and the other vice president would then come from the ZAPU side, which would explain why Kembo Mohadi is there. So But you'd
ultimately have one president in the end.
Yes, you'd have one president in the end, but you would need to balance, because there were 2 separate political parties that were merged into one. ZANU was a political party on its own. ZAPU was a political party in its own, led by Joshua Nkomo. But the period between 1981 and 1986, 1987, the people in Matabeleland received the brand of Robert Mugabe and Emmerson Mnangagwa during this period of Kukurahundi. It led to a unity accord between ZAPU and ZANU. So in order to create a political balance in terms of positions of power, you would always notice that the second vice president would always come from ZAPU. So if your struggle credentials arise from your participation in liberation politics from ZAPU, that position would then be reserved for ZAPU. So Kembo Mohadi's rise in politics arises from the ZAPU side of Zimbabwe's liberation. That explains why that position would go to him. And if you take it back to John Nkomo, he would also come from the ZAPU side. So Kembo Mohadi's position arises, one, from his own political currency as a person with liberation credentials, and as a person with military credentials, but most importantly, as a person who comes from the ZAPU side of the two dominant political parties that liberation movements that brought independence to Zimbabwe.
I want us to further unpack the influence that the military has on Zimbabwe overall. Is it a good thing in terms of taking the country forward?
Look, if you want to understand Zimbabwe, you have to understand it within the historical background that I've given, that it is, the military has always been an important instrument.
But going forward, because now we're in 2017, we're going into 2018. Looking at where the country is going, where the country is hoping to go, because as it stands, you know, there's that sentiment of hope. Is it still relevant? Because yes, you've mentioned history, and you're saying this is how it has been historically and how the military has influenced the country historically. But going forward, is it relevant to take the country forward?
I have argued that we set a dangerous precedent by allowing this to happen, because what essentially we are saying is that even post-colonialism, the military must be an instrument to rebalance the politics in Zim. So my own submission would be that it is a dangerous move, but it is unlikely to stop, because what essentially this has happened is to resolve the succession problems in ZANU. You have removed Robert Mugabe. You have restored the hierarchy of liberation politics, because the aberration that was there with Grace Mugabe and the G40 was that if Grace Mugabe takes over, you're offending the hierarchy of liberation politics, because, for instance, Mnangagwa used to report to Robert Mugabe during the struggle. Chiwenga used to report to Emmerson Mnangagwa. So if what has happened now is the restoration of that hierarchy of liberation politics, because Chiwenga will not have a problem in saluting Mnangagwa, because he did that anyway during the liberation struggle. The vice president will also, Kembo Mohadi will also not have a problem saluting Emmerson Mnangagwa, because that is how the hierarchy of liberation politics worked. It was a problem to have Grace Mugabe, because Grace Mugabe does not have liberation credentials. She was very young when the war was being waged. So what has now happened is that the army is consolidated. But going forward now, the problem is that you have now made the military an unavoidable component of Zimbabwe's politics, and it is going to be extremely difficult for Zimbabwe to extricate itself from a militarized politics, because the succession in ZANU has now been solved for at least the next three presidents. From Mnangagwa to Chiwenga, from Chiwenga perhaps to Muchangwa. So and all of them have military credentials. So there is essentially no room for opposition politics, which opposition politics does not have a military background.
And that's exactly the point that I wanted us to get to. Now let's look at the president's visit to South Africa this week. I think a great focus of his visit was getting the Zimbabwean economy up and running again, saying that Zimbabwe is open for business, that they're ready, and also encouraging Zimbabweans who are abroad and at home to take part in rebuilding the country. Your take on that?
I don't think that was the main reason for the visit here. Of course, the economy has to recover. Of course, that is, Zimbabweans need reprieve from a battered economy. But I don't think that was the main reason. It is not a coincidence that this coup happened around the 25th of August, 24th, 25th of August. ZANU-PF went to a Congress. The two most important positions at the Congress were not filled in. You still remained with the empty vacant positions in respect of the two vice presidents. You only fill in that position now, a day after you leave South Africa, which means that it was important to bring the region, and in particular South Africa, to understand that we don't want to call this a coup, because that's how we do things in Zimbabwe. That's the role of the military in politics, is a natural part of how we do things. It would have been clumsy of them to have the person that was leading an otherwise military coup all of a sudden being appointed as the vice president. That would make it so obvious that this was a coup. Even in classical liberal terms, this would be a coup. So you needed to get South Africa on board to say, President Zuma, this is what we are going to do. We are going to appoint Chiwenga as the vice president, but we want you to understand that this is not a coup. This is how we do things in Zimbabwe. So although it is important to focus on the economy, the main issue, the main prize out of the visit to South Africa was for the region to be appraised of what was likely to happen in Zimbabwe, which is the appointment of Chiwenga.
Because it was expected.
Because it was expected. But if you do it clumsily, that's how coups are done. You take off a government, the next thing, the very same person that was... because you had the army spokesperson, Major General Moyo, who announced on television that they were taking over. He's now a Minister of Foreign Affairs. You now have the general who was leading the coup. He's now a vice president. By any definition, that's a coup. And that would not sit well with SADC and the AU, because SADC and the AU don't tolerate coups. But you need to get SADC and the AU on board in explaining to them that if you use a South African test, what happened in Zimbabwe would constitute a coup. But we want you to understand that this is not a coup because this is the way we do things in Zimbabwe. The role of the military is different from the role of your military in South Africa. So the visit to South Africa had really nothing to do in the main with talking about the economy. It had everything to do...
So that was just a facade to actually explain themselves.
Yes, because there were two things that were needed. You needed to create domestic political legitimacy of the army. That's why ZANU-PF went to a Congress, because you wanted to give it civilian political legitimacy. That's why they immediately called for an extraordinary Congress. But having consolidated the domestic legitimacy, you needed the outside legitimacy, in particular the legitimacy of the African continent. And it is not a coincidence that the first state visit of the head of state of Zimbabwe is South Africa, because of the geopolitical importance of South Africa, both in the region and the African politics. So the visit served to consolidate domestic legitimacy and African legitimacy, and of course the next step would be to get the international legitimacy. But ZANU-PF, knowing ZANU-PF the way we do, it always locates its issues within African politics, to say, to the extent you think Zimbabwe is a problem, it is an African problem. That's why instead of going to Europe, to the British or to the Americans, they start in Africa. When the opposition is all over in Europe, they start here. The visit to South Africa had everything to do with finalizing this coup and finalizing the African legitimacy that they needed.
Okay, so what's the way forward for Zimbabwe? I mean, we've looked at the politics of it, but people on the ground generally have their own sentiments of the way forward. We saw the farmers, some of the farmers going back to their land yesterday and getting quite a very warm welcome, actually. What's the way forward?
The way forward is that the economy has to improve. The people of Zimbabwe have endured difficulties for a very long time, and it is important that that economy improves. And I just hope that Zimbabweans, in the course of celebrating what might be some semblance of economic revival, because that economy can't get any worse, so it can only get better. Yeah. So if Mnangagwa is able to solve the liquidity problem in Zimbabwe, and there's a cash reinjection, they redeposit money in the Nostro accounts that they've taken money from, and people are able to go into the bank and get their money, it is extremely important that the Zimbabwean economy improves. But what is even much more important is that there must be an opening up of political space in Zim. Zimbabweans must be able to express themselves politically. Zimbabwe must be able to express legitimate political views about the direction of the country without fear of reparation. But however, it appears that they want to take the Chinese model, where you stabilize the economy is functioning, but you close the political space and don't allow Zimbabweans to express themselves. Zimbabweans have become used to the call for the opening up of political space. And if Mnangagwa goes that route, I think that is more than likely going to face resistance. Of course, in the first few years, as the economy improves, because when an economy improves under circumstances where people have lived in a battered economy, they tend to disengage from politics, because now the economy is functioning, they need to look after themselves, they need to look for jobs, so they disengage from politics. But after some time, they go back to their default position of saying, we want to demand the opening of political space. So in the short term, there's going to be a disengagement from politics, because Zimbabweans are saying the economy is improving, let's look after our kids. But if Mnangagwa continues to close political space, because in all these trips that he's doing, he's only talking about the economy. He's not talking about the opening up of political space. And that is the danger that Zimbabwe is going to, this government is going to face. if they solve the economic problem without opening up the political space, then we are going to enter into another phase of 2008 where Zimbabweans begin to demand political space.
Nqobi, I think a good way to end up would be to look at South Africa specifically. I mean, we saw earlier at the end of the ANC's 54th elective conference, one of the biggest resolutions was the expropriation of land without compensation. Now, do you think there are any lessons that South Africa can learn from the Zimbabwean story?
The question of land in Africa is an emotive one. And they should never be debate that the native African people must have their land. That debate should never be there. The question of land should be resolved in favor of the native people. The debates around the effect of land reform on the economy is a debate that can be done after a premise has been established that it should never be debate that the land in Africa belongs to African people and belongs to those who identify themselves genuinely, emotively as African people. So to the extent that South Africa want to move into the issue of expropriation of land without compensation, I actually don't think you have a choice. Because Zimbabwe moved along those route of willing buyer, willing seller basis for a very long time, until such time there was these land grabs. I'm not sure that a debate around land being compensated for is a sustainable one, given the nature of the South African economy, for that matter. Even in Zimbabwe, when they're saying that they're going to compensate white farmers, where is that money going to come from? I mean, hospitals are collapsing, schools are collapsing. You want to take the little money that you have and go and compensate white farmers for land instead of injecting that money into the economy. So essentially what I'm suggesting to you is, I don't think that you can run away from the idea of expropriation of land without compensation, because it's simply not possible to pay for it. And it's simply not possible to keep the majority of native people in squalid conditions. It is unjustifiable.